Hi everyone, this is the first video in my tutorial series, How to Sound Design. Today, we will be covering the topic Basic Waveforms. If you enjoyed this video tutorial, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to my Patreon in the description box of this video. By becoming a $5 patron, you'll have access to the synthesizer interfaces I interact with in my tutorials, so you can follow along as I teach concepts and provide examples, and you can use for your own personal use. Learning objectives for this first tutorial will be: know what the basic waveforms are, understand and identify the unique characteristics for each waveform, identify each waveform by their shape, understand the behaviors of a waveform when we change its characteristics. There are 4 basic fundamental waveforms you need to know in order to maximize your creativity when you're designing sounds: sine wave, saw wave, pulse wave, and triangle wave. First, let's look at the sine wave. The sine wave is the most fundamental sound in nature. If we were to break down a complex sound into its individual parts, you would get hundreds and maybe thousands of sine waves with varying characteristics. The sine wave is basically the atom of sound, and I mean that figuratively. Let's look at the sine wave plotted on a graph. Press sine wave 1 under the plotting examples. This first part is the first half of a cycle, and then there is the second half of a cycle. This would be considered one complete cycle. Take note of its shape. Each half of the cycle look like parabolas. And imagine the x-axis of this graph, or the horizontal plane of this graph, represents time. Let's press sine wave 2. Now this sine wave looks different than our previous example. It has more cycles. There are more cycles per second compared to our previous example. Why? It has a higher frequency. Here we have 5 cycles. Let's press sine wave 3. Again, this sine wave looks different than our previous example because it has an even higher frequency. There are many more cycles per second. Frequency means the cycles per second of a waveform. As we increase the cycles per second, the waveform cycles will appear thinner and the sound will be higher. As the cycles per second decreases, the cycles will appear wider and it will sound bassy. Let's explore this concept further in our interface. First, we need to load the synth on the server. Then we need to choose which waveform, the sine wave. Finally, we just turn it on. Here we have a frequency of 90 Hertz. As you can hear, it sounds bassy. Let's take a look in the oscilloscope. As we can see, the cycles are wide. Let's look at the oscilloscope as we turn the frequency up. The waveform's cycles appear thinner, and audibly it sounds higher and thinner, and a bit more piercing as we get even higher into the frequency range. Frequency also translates to pitch, or it can be thought of as a musical note. A frequency of 220 Hz is the note A. Right away you can see how we can use a sine wave as an instrument. It may not be the most interesting instrument, but it has been used. For example, listen to Turquoise Hexagon Sun by Boards of Canada. The opening synth sounds are sine waves. This leads into the next important characteristic of a sine wave. The sine wave has no harmonics. You may ask, what are harmonics? A harmonic is a common multiple of a fundamental frequency. A fundamental frequency is the lowest partial in a waveform, the part of the waveform we perceive the most because it's the loudest. When we look at the sine wave in a frequency analyzer, we will only see the fundamental frequency, this one big peak. If it had harmonics, we would see many peaks and valleys, but not taller than the fundamental frequency. Let's explore this concept in our interface again. In the bottom right quadrant of your screen, you'll see a frequency analyzer. So let's load up the synth again. Let's choose the sine wave as our waveform, and then let's turn it on. So as you notice, when we move the frequency slider up and down, you will see one big peak in this frequency analyzer moving across the x-axis. You will only see one big peak because a sine wave has no harmonics. If we were analyzing a saw wave, a pulse wave, or a triangle wave, we would see many peaks and valleys. And you will be noticing this in the next video tutorial. But for right now, since we're only analyzing the sine wave, there are no peaks and valleys. There is only the fundamental frequency, this one big peak. The sine wave's lack of harmonics contributes to its uninteresting sound or its timbre. The harmonic content of a sound influences the timbre of a sound. Timbre is the tonal difference between a guitar and saxophone when they're playing the exact same note. The guitar is a plucking instrument and a saxophone is a reed instrument that requires our air. The difference in sound is timbre. If we were to study the harmonic relationships in a guitar and saxophone, they would be vastly different. Harmonics may be one of the most important concepts in sound design. A lot of what we're doing is manipulating the harmonic content or frequency content of a sound to get interesting and pleasing timbres. A sine wave almost has a lack of a timbre. The only thing it has is its fundamental frequency. The next important characteristic is the amplitude. The amplitude is how tall the sine wave is along the y-axis, which translates to how loud we hear the sine wave to our perception. The lower the amplitude, the quieter the sine wave will be. While the sine wave is not the most interesting sound, it has been used for interesting ideas. Sine waves have been used for kick drums, to add intense moments in movie trailers, and purely just as synthesizers. The electronic musician Caroline Polachek, who is widely known as the singer in the band Chairlift and other various projects, devoted an entire album to only using sine waves, called Drawing the Target Around the Arrow. Check it out if you're curious. In the next video, we will cover saw, pulse, and triangle waveforms, which will be a little more interesting due to the fact that these waveforms have harmonics, so each one has their own unique timbre. Please leave any constructive criticism in the comment section of this video. Anything you think can lead to a better educational experience. I hope you learned a lot from this video. Thanks for watching.